Good afternoon. As Mr. Bell just said, my name is Catherine Sinkovitz. I am from Richland, Michigan, and it is my honor to introduce our speaker this afternoon. Andrew Roberts is a historian and an honorary senior scholar at Gonville and Caius College, Cambridge. Dr. Roberts is a fellow of the Royal Society of Literature, a trustee of the Margaret Thatcher Archive Trust, and a director of the Harry Frank Guggenheim Foundation. He is the recipient of numerous book awards, including the Wolfson History Prize, the Intercollegiate Studies Institute Prize, the Emery Reeves Prize, the British Army Military Book of the Year Award, and a History Prize from Foundation Napoleon. A regular guest on British and American television and radio, Dr. Roberts writes for the Sunday Telegraph, The Spectator, Literary Review, Mail on Sunday, and the Wall Street Journal. He is the author of several books, including Eminent Churchillians, Hitler and Churchill, Secrets of Leadership, A History of the English-Speaking Peoples Since 1900, Master and Commanders, How Four Titans Won the War in the West, The Storm of War, A New History of the Second World War, a book which reached number 2 on the Sunday Times bestseller list, and Napoleon, A Life, which our speaker just informed me has just been auctioned by Harvey Weinstein for a TV series. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Andrew Roberts.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great honor to be invited to address you today, and thank you very much indeed for those kind words. It's perfectly true that my book got to number 2 in the bestseller list, beaten only by a book about Michael Jackson. The title of my talk, Churchill's Early Life, is a deliberately ambiguous, rather dexterous one, because it allows me not only to speak about his youth, but also about his autobiography, My Early Life. And the Times review of that book, which appeared on the publication day, on the 20th of October 1930, mentioned not only the charm and briskness of this book, but also its humour, headlong excitement, quiet irony, melancholy regret for vanished customs and glories, love of sport, and the pleasures of friendship. Although it also made the slightly snide point that the material is, of course, splendid, as Mr. Churchill will agree. The child is the father of the man, wrote William Wordsworth. And in many ways, this is true of Winston Churchill, recalling that great day on the 10th of May, 1940, which, as was mentioned, we've just celebrated the 75th anniversary of, the day in which he became Prime Minister. But also, of course, the dreadful day that Hitler unleashed his blitzkrieg on the West. Churchill wrote in his war memoirs, "I felt as if I were walking with destiny and that all my past life had been but a preparation for this hour and this trial." And in a sense, what I would like to do today is to look at his early life and to look at the way that his youth was indeed a preparation for the hour and the trial of 1940, because it showed again and again the extraordinary leadership capacities that he had, the sheer character, the personality of the man shines through again and again from the many different vicissitudes that he faced, not just physical, but also moral vicissitudes. Now, clearly, this is no rags to riches story of the type so beloved by modern-day biopics, where an outsider from nowhere triumphs over the establishment or anything like that. He was the grandson of a duke, and not just any old common or garden duke. He was the grandson of the Duke of Marlborough. And so, as I take you through his life, I'd like you to keep in mind several things, and many of them mentioned in that Times review, in fact. The sense of humour, the effect his family life, or the lack of it, had on his psychological development, his powerful sense of not having much time, completely absurd as it turned out. In fact, he lived to be 90, but he didn't believe that he had that much time, and so therefore he was always in a tearing hurry. his extraordinary lust for adventure, his intense competitiveness with his contemporaries, and how incredibly accident-prone he was, with constant near-death experiences. When you go to Dublin Castle, which I was there last week, in fact, you, in the state apartments, can see a very large room which is decorated with nothing but the paintings of former viceroys of Ireland, almost all of them British aristocrats. In fact, in the 10 years before and 10 years after Winston Churchill's grandfather, the 7th Duke of Marlborough, was Viceroy of Ireland, the post was held by 2 dukes, 1 marquis and 3 earls. And Winston Churchill lived there from the age of 2 because his father, Lord Randolph Churchill, was private secretary to his own father, the 7th Duke. And it was in a park in Dublin, at around the age of 4, that Winston Churchill was thrown from a donkey in Ireland and concussed when they thought they'd come across what they believed was a Fenian demonstration, but in fact turned out to be a route march of British troops. I was thrown off and had concussion of the brain, he later wrote. This was my first introduction to Irish politics. It was his first introduction, but it was hardly life-threatening, but there were going to be many more accidents to come. One of the most famous passages in my early life concerns his mother, Jenny Jerome, the beautiful daughter of a Brooklyn business tycoon, Leonard Jerome. My mother always seemed to me a fairy princess, he wrote famously, a radiant being possessed of limitless riches and power. She shone for me like the evening star. I loved her dearly, but at a distance. The untrue word in that was always. She was not a radiant being much for him after he discovered that he and his brother Jack had their inheritance from their father misappropriated by Jenny Jerome. But instead, because she was so distant, affection and love and surrogate motherhood was provided by his governess, Mrs. Everest, a lady whose photograph he kept by his bed for the rest of his life. And he also paid for the upkeep during his life of her grave, which I was very proud at lunch today to discover has been kept up after that by Richard and Barbara Langworth, who are here in the audience today. The first boarding school that he went to, St George's in Ascot, he actually started to attend a month prior to his 8th birthday. So he went off to boarding school at the age of 7. Ladies and gentlemen, this is not child abuse. I know it sounds like it, but my father and grandfather and great-grandfather went to boarding school at similar ages, as did I, and so did my children. Ripping children from their parents at a tender and impressionable age and handing them over to sexually questionable total strangers is not a prima facie case of child abuse, but something instead that is called the British education system. Some of Churchill's earliest memories of St George's must be called into question, not least because he kept referring to it as St James's in my early life. He made himself out to be a dim child intellectually, whereas his school reports actually showed that he shone at some subjects like English and history. In Latin, however, his contemporaries did far better than him, which seems to have led to a slight sense of chippiness towards the academically gifted, especially those who went on to read classics at Oxford and Cambridge. Faced with an inability to grasp the first declension, he wrote, "There was one thing I could do, I could learn by heart." And his ability to memorize huge amounts of verse and prose stayed with him for life and would astonish contemporaries. Many are the occasions when he would quote reams of poetry or old musical songs or speeches from plays, and he'd do it from memory, half a century after having learned them. "How I hated this school," he later wrote, and small wonder, because in all the 12 years of his education, no one ever succeeded in making me write a Latin verse or learn any Greek except the alphabet. And at St George's, quote, 2 or 3 times a month, the whole school was marshalled in the library, and 1 or more delinquents were hauled off to an adjoining apartment by the 2 head boys, and there flogged until they bled freely, while the rest sat quaking, listening to their screams. Such beatings, usually but not always carried out without overtly sadistic undertones, were immensely common in the British public school system and indeed carried on until the late 1970s, as my own parts of my own body can attest. I've always since noticed that when supporters of capital punishment confidently attest it never did me any harm, my private judgment is always, I'll be the judge of that. Such beatings nearly broke Churchill's health entirely, and after a serious illness, his parents took him away. In 1883, aged 9, he was transferred to a school in Brighton kept by two ladies where he stayed for 3 years. He nearly died from an attack of double pneumonia, but overall he was much happier there, where he could learn the things that interested him in a happy environment: French, history, learning poetry by heart, riding, swimming. In the Chapel Royal at Brighton, aged about 10, while the whole school turned to the east when the Apostles' Creed was recited, Churchill thought that the Low Church, Mrs. Everest, would consider that a popish practice, and I conceived it my duty to testify against it. I therefore stood solidly to my front. I was conscious of having created a sensation. I prepared myself for martyrdom. However, when we got home, no comment of any kind was made about my behaviour. I was almost disappointed and looked forward to the next occasion for a further demonstration of my faith. He didn't get it, because the following week the school was shown to pews facing east-west rather than north-south. But this was an early indication of Churchill's willingness to stand up for what he believed in, if necessary, totally alone, or was it a deliberate perversity combined with an element of showing off, as implied by his sense of disappointment at the lack of official response? Might the Anglican school not have responded because they didn't want to get involved in accusations of Anglo-Catholic practices with the Chancellor of the Exchequer's son within a decade of the highly controversial Public Worship Regulation Act? These are matters for Churchill experts, let none say pedants, such as Richard Langworth and Larry Arne and myself to resolve. In 1888, aged 13, Churchill entered Harrow less than 18 months after his father's sensational resignation as Chancellor of the Exchequer. Because of his father's fame, when roll call was taken, when he was in his first year at Harrow, with a name starting with S for Spencer Churchill, and in the bottom form because of his low examination marks in Greek and Latin, he came at the very end of the hundreds of boys filing past the headmaster in the schoolyard. Quote, large numbers of visitors of both sexes used to wait on the school steps in order to see me march by, and I frequently used to hear the irreverent comment, "Why, he's the last of all." Such an humiliation could have had a devastating effect on a lesser child, but for Churchill it was obviously a spur. He believed that by being put in the lowest form at Harrow, it meant I gained an immense advantage over the cleverer boys. They all went on to learn Latin and Greek and splendid things like that, but I was taught English. The word splendid in that sentence was clearly meant sarcastically, by the way, though Churchill employed sarcasm far less in my early life and his other writings than its far smarter cousin, rich English high irony. His excellent English teacher, Robert Somervell, taught him grammar. I learned it thoroughly. Thus I got into my bones the essential structure of the ordinary British sentence, which is a noble thing. Elsewhere he wrote, I would make them all learn English, talking about school children, and then I would let the clever ones learn Latin as an honour and Greek as a treat. He was joking again about the classics, later writing, they told me how Mr. Gladstone read Homer for fun, which I thought served him right. At Harrow, Churchill won a prize for reciting no fewer than 1,200 lines of Macaulay's Lades of Ancient Rome without error. This would have been possible only if he were utterly bound up with the tales they told, tales of heroism in the ancient world. An important influence on his patriotism, written by Harrow masters such as John Farmer, who wrote the music, and E. Bowen, who wrote the lyrics, they were intended to link the pupils' present-day conduct and patriotism to Harrow's and Britain's glorious past, articulating a strong continuum between them. Thus, the song Stet Fortuna Domus of 1891, which was first performed when Churchill was at the school, has a stanza that goes, tonight we praise the former days in patriotic chorus and celebrate the good and great who trod the hill before us, where Sheridan and Peel began in days of Whig and Tory, where Ashley vowed to serve the crowd and Byron rose to glory. In Giants, another song that Churchill sang, Harrovians were specifically enjoined to remember that the hero race may come and go, but doesn't exactly die, for all of we, whoever we may be, come up to the giants of old, you see. Thus, his historical glory was not just something to respect in awe, but to try to emulate and even to better. Churchill was not therefore just in competition with his contemporaries, but he felt he was also in competition with Sheridan, Peel, Ashley and Byron. On leaving Harrow, his father agreed to let him go into the army. For years, I thought my father, with his experience and flair, had discerned in me the qualities of military genius, but I was later told that he had only come to the conclusion that I was not clever enough to go to the bar. Churchill had a collection of toy soldiers, ultimately nearly 1,500 strong, and he'd long been fascinated by warfare. Moreover, it was a way that he could leapfrog those of his contemporaries who were going to Oxford and Cambridge. But back to his accidents. In January 1893, visiting his aunt, Lady Wimborne, at Bournemouth, he attempted to jump a deep cleft, lost his hold, and fell 29 feet from a bridge onto hard ground. He was unconscious for 3 days. In bed nearly 3 months, he suffered a ruptured kidney hemorrhage and broke a bone in his mid-back, which was only discovered in an X-ray in 1962. For a year, I looked at life round a corner, he wrote. It was lucky he looked at it at all, and truly extraordinary that he had achieved all he did by 1962 with an undiagnosed broken bone in his back. It was in 1893 that Churchill met Arthur Balfour, Joseph Chamberlain, Edward Carson, Lord Rosebery, Herbert Asquith, and John Morley, the great politicians of the late Victorian era. So soon as I was convalescent, I began to go to the House of Commons and listen to the great debates, he wrote. He was present at the most climactic debate of the entire 19th century, Gladstone's winding up of the second reading of the Irish Home Rule Bill on the 21st of April, 1893. And in retrospect, it's clear that the early death of his father, aged only 46, meant that Churchill, who was 20 at the time, would be sure to enter politics one day. In June 1893, he qualified for the Sandhurst cadetship in the cavalry on his third attempt. In my early life, he considered what might have happened if he hadn't gone to Sandhurst, making the excellent joke that I might have gravitated to the bar and persons might have been hanged through my defence who now nurse their guilty secret complacency. He entered the cavalry because it offered easier entry than the more intellectual or less unintellectual infantry and artillery. Besides, as he wrote, the uniforms were much more magnificent. His father was unimpressed and, quote, I received from him a long and very severe letter expressing the bleakest view of my educational career, showing a marked lack of appreciation at my success in examination and warning me of the danger in which I plainly lay of being a social wastrel. It's hard to make Lord Randolph Churchill, ladies and gentlemen, out to be much more than a harsh Victorian father. That summer, Churchill and his younger brother Jack went on a walking tour of Switzerland, and they climbed the Wetterhorn and the Monte Rosa mountains. He also, not the kind of thing that one does that social wastrels necessarily do. He was also nearly drowned at Lake Lausanne when he and his brother Jack, who he curiously only refers to as a younger companion in his autobiography, went swimming, and a breeze picked up and then sailed away the boat faster than he could swim towards it. Bang in the middle of Lake Lausanne, he was facing yet another brush with death. This time he even gave it a colour. I saw death as near as I believe I've ever seen him, he later wrote. He was swimming in the water at our side, whispering from time to time in the rising wind, which continued to carry the boat away from us at about the same speed we could swim. No help was near. Unaided, we could never reach the what's the thing on the edge of lakes? The shore. Sure, thank you very much indeed. I've got the floor here. Unaided, we could never reach the shore. I now swam for life. I scrambled in and rode back for my companion who, though tired, had not apparently realised the dull yellow glare of mortal peril that had so suddenly played around us. In spring 1894, it became clear to everyone that his father was gravely ill. Of course, no medical diagnosis of his illness was offered by Churchill in my early life, who himself believed, along with most other people at the time, that it was syphilis, although several historians today believe instead it was a rare disease of the brain. Of his father, he wrote, in a line surely as autobiographical as biographical, he embodied that force, caprice and charm which so often springs from genius. In June, he said goodbye to his father as his father went off on a round-the-world tour. He patted me on the knee in a gesture which, however simple, was perfectly informing. I never saw him again except as a swiftly fading shadow. All my dreams of comradeship with him, of entering Parliament at his side and in his support, were ended. There remained for me only to pursue his aims and vindicate his memory. The previous November, Churchill had become 20 years old, writing later, 20 to 25, those are the years. Don't be content with things as they are. You'll make all kinds of mistakes, but as long as you're generous and true and also fierce, you cannot hurt the world or seriously distress her. She was made to be wooed and won by youth. On the 20th of February, 1895, he was commissioned into the 4th Queen's Own Hussars as a second lieutenant. I had the ill luck to strain my tailor's muscle, that's the sartorius muscle. It's the longest muscle in the body. It's the one that goes down the thigh, on which one's grip on a horse depends. In consequence, I suffered tortures. Galvanic treatment was then unknown. One simply had to go on tearing at a lacerated muscle with the awful penalty of being thought a booby if one begged off even for a day. The physical courage, ladies and gentlemen, of Churchill, it equaled his moral courage, which is rare. In the closing decade of the Victorian era, the empire had enjoyed so long a spell of almost unbroken peace, he wrote, that medals and all they represented in experience and adventure were becoming extremely scarce on the British Army. As so often, it was the honesty of my early life that gave ammunition to Churchill's detractors. He was accused of being a mere medal hunter, with this sentence often held up as evidence. But the key wording is all they represented in experience and adventure. War service was the path to distinction. He wasn't rich enough to maintain hunters as well as polo ponies. His father, Lord Randolph, was the younger son of the Duke. So instead of being able to afford to do this, he took the decision to use his 10 weeks' leave to visit the Cuban Civil War, joining the side of the Spanish Captain General, Marshal Martinez Campos. He went there via New York, writing to his mother on the 10th of November, "What an extraordinary people the Americans are. Their hospitality is a revelation to me, and they make you feel at home and at ease in a way that I've never before experienced." It's good that some things don't change. You might call it tomfoolery, he also wrote, to travel thousands of miles with money one can ill afford, to get up at 4 o'clock in the morning in the hope of getting into a scrape in the company of perfect strangers is certainly hardly a rational proceeding. The 30th of November was my 21st birthday, and on that day, for the first time, I heard shots fired in anger and heard bullets strike flesh or whistle through the air. That's half true, ladies and gentlemen. In fact, it was the next day. On the day itself, he might have heard bullets fired in anger, but he didn't hear them whistle through the air. There's a new book by Hans Klepak about precisely this period in Churchill's life. But certainly on the 1st of December, whilst eating a chicken outside a place called Arroyo Blanco, which is right in the centre of Cuba, which I visited, in fact, in May of this year, Churchill heard a ragged volley rang out from the edge of the forest. The horse immediately next to me, not my horse, gave a bound. It had been shot in the ribs. And as I watched these proceedings, I could not help reflecting that the bullet which had struck the chestnut had certainly passed within a foot of my head. So at any rate, I had been under fire. That was something. Nevertheless, I began to take a more thoughtful view of our enterprise than I had hitherto. That night, not only shots but volleys resounded through the night. A bullet ripped through the thatch of our tent. Another wounded an orderly just outside. I fortified myself by dwelling on the fact that the Spanish officer whose hammock was slung between me and the enemy's fire was a man of substantial physique. Indeed, one might have called him fat. I've never been prejudiced against fat men. At any rate, I didn't grudge this one his meals. Of the fighting the next day, he said, there were sounds about us, sometimes like a sigh, sometimes like a whistle, and at other times like the buzz of an offended hornet. He returned from Cuba with three things that stayed with him for life: his love of cigars, of siestas, and being in the thick of wherever was the most important thing happening at the time. In October 1896, he, at the Sassoon dock in Bombay Harbour in India, modern-day Mumbai, he, sure enough, had another accident. We came across alongside a great stone wall with dripping steps and iron rings for handholds, he later wrote. The boat rose and fell 4 or 5 feet with the surges. I put out my hand and grasped at a ring, but before I could get my feet on the steps, the boat swung away, giving my right shoulder a sharp and peculiar wrench. I scrambled up all right, made a few remarks of a general nature, mostly beginning with the early letters of the alphabet, hugged my shoulder and soon thought no more about it. Yet in fact, his dislocated shoulder meant that I had sustained an injury which was to last me in my life and which was to cripple me at polo, to prevent me ever playing tennis, and to be a grave embarrassment to me in moments of peril, violence and effort. Once it nearly went out through a too expansive gesture in the House of Commons. Yet it wasn't all bad news, because had he been able to use a sword at the Battle of Omdurman rather than a Mauser pistol, my story might not have got so far in the telling. He philosophized in my early life, when you make a mistake, it may very easily serve you better than the best advised decision. Life is a whole, and luck is a whole, and no part of them can be separated from the rest. Extraordinarily, ladies and gentlemen, he wrote that in 1930, the very year before he resigned from the Tory front bench, which allowed him to be out of office during the wilderness years, and thus unsullied by any collective responsibility for appeasement. In the winter of 1896, the desire for learning came upon me. He liked the feel of words fitting and falling into their places like pennies in a slot, he wrote. He hadn't been to Oxford or Cambridge, but claims not to have been chippy about it. We never set much store by them or their affected superiority, he said of people who did go to Oxford and Cambridge, remembering that they were only at their books while we were commanding men and guarding the empire. Now I pity undergraduates when I see what frivolous lives many of them lead in the midst of precious, fleeting opportunity. After all, a man's life must be nailed to the cross of either thought or action. I'm not convinced about this, that he didn't mind about the affected superiority of people who went to Oxford and Cambridge. There are so many slighted references to them. But nonetheless, his remark about guarding the empire obviously did matter to him deeply, because you can't have Churchill without empire. I was very pleased to see Larry Arnn in his excellent book Churchill's Trial puts the empire in the middle there with war and peace, central areas of the book, because Winston Churchill fought not just for Britain and also of course for democracy, but also he fought for the empire. And although it's not very popular at the moment, the British Empire was absolutely epicentral to his entire outlook. All through the long, glistening middle hours of the Indian day, I devoured Gibbon, he wrote, and then after that, Edward Gibbon's autobiography, and then Macaulay. But Churchill was shocked by Macaulay's history, primarily because it was harsh about the first Duke of Marlborough. Was it from Gibbon that he got his religious agnosticism, or from Winwood Reade's book, The Martyrdom of Man, which argued that all religions were essentially the same and which denied the divinity of Jesus? The remark he made about churchgoing was that at Harrow there were 3 services every Sunday, besides morning and evening prayers throughout the week. All this was very good. I accumulated in those years so fine a surplus in the book of observance that I have been drawing confidently upon it ever since. In India, Churchill displayed what he called, actually it's extraordinary, he was able to read all this Gibbon and Macaulay and all the other people. He also read Schopenhauer and Lecky and the great thinkers of the day, because he also suffered from what he called complete absorption with the game of polo. He played never less than 8 and more often 10 or 12 chukkers of polo a day. And never in the history of Indian polo had a cavalry regiment from southern India, he was based in Bangalore in southern India, won the Inter-Regimental Cup. Yet they won that, and his regiment, the 4th Hussars, won that, even though Churchill had to play with his arm strapped to his side out of pain from his injury, the dislocated shoulder. Just truly extraordinary. Not least, of course, that he also scored the winning goal. He was staying at Goodwood Park, which is one of the great stately homes of England, the house of the Duke of Richmond, and he was on leave when he read of the Pathan revolt on the northwest frontier, and he immediately got himself attached to the new force that was being got together there, the Malakand Field Force, and it was there that he learnt to drink whiskey. I've been brought up and trained to have the utmost contempt for people who got drunk, except on very exceptional occasions and a few anniversaries, he wrote. And I would like to have had the boozing scholars of the universities wheeled into line and properly chastised for their squalid misuse of what I must ever regard as a great gift of the gods. Churchill was incredibly politically incorrect to modern ears. It has to be said. There's a passage in my early life in which he says, "We had the very strong spirit of the diehards and the young bloods of the enemy. They wanted to shoot at us, and we wanted to shoot at them. So a lot of people were killed, and on our side, the widows have had to be pensioned by the imperial government, and others were badly wounded and hopped around for the rest of their lives, and it was all very exciting, and for those of us who didn't get killed or hurt, very jolly." On a punitive expedition in the Malakand Field Force among the mud villages of the Mamund Valley, Churchill found himself with 5 British officers and about 85 Sikh soldiers when, in an area that had seemed totally quiet, suddenly the mountainside sprang to life. Swords flashed from behind rocks, bright flags waved here and there, a dozen widely scattered smoke puffs broke from the ragged face in front of us. Loud explosions resounded close at hand. From high above us on the crag, 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 feet above us, white or blue figures appeared, dropping down the mountainside from ledge to ledge like monkeys down the branches of a tall tree. A shrill cry arose from many points. And then, moments later, the British officer who was with him was spinning round just behind me, his face a mass of blood, his right eye cut out. Yes, it was certainly an adventure. It was a point of honour not to leave wounded men behind. Death by inches and hideous mutilation are the invariable measure meted out to those who fall in battle into the hands of the Pathan tribesmen. So in the course of saving this officer, this wounded officer, 5 Britons and Sikhs, including Churchill, went back to bring him back, whereupon one of the Sikhs was shot through the calf, and Churchill got him back by dragging him along by his collar to safety. Churchill had risked his life, therefore, to save the soldiers. In the same action, the regimental adjutant was cut to pieces with a sword, and Churchill was so keen to avenge him that he almost got cut off by the enemy. I looked around. I was all alone with the enemy. Not a friend was to be seen. I ran as fast as I could. There were bullets everywhere. I got to the first knoll. Hurrah, the Sikhs were holding the lower one. Yet another close brush with death, ladies and gentlemen, and the chance to show character and leadership, but also the judgment to know when to run like hell. Such brushes with death were to be repeated regularly thereafter, not least in a cavalry charge at the Battle of Omdurman, his attempt to save an ambushed train in the Boer War, his escape from the Boer prisoner of war camp in Pretoria, and so on and so on. Yet Churchill didn't crave excitement for itself like some kind of extreme sports junkie today. Rather, he knew that he needed the attention and medals that came with it in order to leapfrog his contemporaries, especially the cleverer boys. If he was to attain his dream of vindicating his brilliant, stricken, but distant and often disdainful father, he needed fame, and he needed it on his own terms. Humour, headlong excitement, quiet irony, melancholy regret for vanished customs and glories, love of sport, the pleasures of friendship. That anonymous Times reviewer of my early life was uncannily accurate, both about the book itself and about what actuated Winston Churchill. When he came to the premiership in May 1940, aged 65, it was as a fully formed leader, possessed of all the attributes and personality traits necessary for this hour and this trial. Extraordinarily, though, almost all of these, though not, of course, the political experience that was also necessary, he had attained before the absurdly young age of 25. Thank you very much indeed. So we have plenty of time, about 20 minutes or so, for questions from anyone other than Richard Langworth. If you put your hands up, this lady and this gentleman are going to give you the microphone. Please don't feel constrained just to ask questions about his early life. I'll try and ask questions about wider thing as well.
I've read that book many times, and the one thing that puzzles me is Churchill has a younger brother, and we never hear anything about the younger brother. Tell us about Jack.
Yes, that's right. He is mentioned, of course, but he's not a central figure, and he did actually cut him out of that Lausanne incident, and didn't mention that it was his brother whose life he had put in danger by jumping off the boat. Jack was a brave man in his own right. He fought in the Boer War. He was at Gallipoli. He was put into the... he got onto the staff on the Western Front. He became a stockbroker. He loved his brother dearly. They were extremely friendly and close. But he was not, I think it's fair to say, an essential figure in the Churchillian canon. He wasn't one of the true intimates in the way that Bracken or Beaverbrook or Prof. Lindemann or any of those other people were. And so it was a happy fraternal feeling that he had towards his brother, and that his brother had towards him. His brother was very proud of his achievements. But he didn't take advice, for example, from his brother. But he was good to his brother when it came to finances, family finances, and everything. He was very decent and honourable, as you'd have expected.
Hi, Alex Bookman. I'm a senior here at Hillsdale. For many of us, Churchill is a hero. We have a statue of him, obviously, at Hillsdale. I was wondering, who did Churchill look up to in his early life, whether that be through reading, and was it, I guess, people in antiquity, or even, his superiors during his time in the military?
Well, of course, the primary one was his father. And he took much of his political philosophy that he kept for the rest of his life from his father's concept. His father really was the inventor of the concept of Tory democracy, trust the people. And that was something that Churchill stayed with Churchill very much for the rest of his life. He admired, when he grew up, he admired Benjamin Disraeli, but he was only 7 when Disraeli died. He remembered Disraeli's death very well and mentions it in My Early Life. Really, though, it's the first Duke of Marlborough, his great ancestor, who was the victor in the War of Spanish Succession, which was... he was the greatest soldier, along with the Duke of Wellington, who's the greatest soldier in the history of the British Army. And so he was an ultimate hero for Winston Churchill, and several more, Admiral Nelson and Drake, who he was related to very distantly. These were the giants of British military history. Also, Oliver Cromwell. He tried to have a ship named after Oliver Cromwell, but failed when King George V wouldn't put up with it. Understandably so, considering that Oliver Cromwell was a regicide, but nonetheless it had been 300 years or so earlier. He was very, very well versed in all of the lays of ancient Rome, the great ancients. You know that these were the stories that he grew up with, and as I say, he was able to recite 1,200 lines of Macaulay's Ancient Rome. It's a wonderful. I do recommend it. I haven't read the whole thing from cover to cover, I admit, but the bits that I have read and was forced to learn at school are still pretty magnificent and moving.
I was wondering if you could say something about his marriage to Clementine.
Yes, well, thank you, madam. It doesn't crop up except for the last sentence of My Early Life, where he said that he got married and lived happily ever after. But that's pretty true. That's what happened. He married a very remarkable and impressive lady in Clementine Churchill, who looked out for him. She didn't like all of his friends, which is perfectly understandable because several of them must have been extremely difficult people to have got on with. But nonetheless, she provided the domestic stability that he needed, love and affection, 4 children, and a home life in which he knew that he could sally forth out to the House of Commons night after night. Very regularly, the House of Commons wouldn't break up until midnight. And so, you know, that kind of thing is incredibly tough on family life, but there's no indication that it was too tough on his. She was a very impressive, remarkable woman during the Second World War. She helped the Red Cross Aid to Russia Fund, which helped the Red Cross Aid to Russia Fund, which in fact she led it, I think, which was important. And all in all, there isn't a sort of whiff of negativity, I think, or let alone scandal about a very remarkable woman.
What role did Winston Churchill's grandparents play in his early life?
His grandparents played pretty small role. He was the 7th Duke, was the Viceroy of Ireland, as I say. So he was a sort of extremely grand figure. But Richard will tell me the age at which he died, Churchill's age when the Duke died. But I think he was fairly young, wasn't he, when the Duke died? So it wasn't too much of an effect. But the next Duke, the 8th Duke, Sonny, became a great friend of, was a great friend of Churchill's. And of course, Blenheim was a place that Churchill always felt was almost the second home to him. And it was at Blenheim that he proposed to Clementine, to go back to the earlier question. But more importantly, this Marlborough connection was vital to him for 2 reasons. The first was that the Spencer Churchill name is one of the grandest and most aristocratic in Britain, and therefore gave him a standing, an automatic standing in society, which also gave him the kind of confidence that would be needed in order to take all these risks and embark on all these adventures. And the second thing was that because of the history of, to go back to the question before that, his great ancestor, the 1st Duke, this giant of British military history, he also felt he had a lot to live up to. And so it was a name, in a sense, rather like that phrase about the Bonapartes, about Napoleon III, his name was both his making and his undoing. Winston Churchill's name could have been, was part of the making, but also could have been part of the undoing if he hadn't managed to live up to it. As it is, of course, he lived up to it and even put it in the shade.
Good evening, sir. My question is about Churchill's personality. He's often described by several of his advisors as temperamental. I was just wondering if you could comment on his own personal leadership style and how it affected his conduct of the war.
Yes, he was indeed deeply temperamental. Not least, this is evidenced by the fact he kept bursting into tears. He was the most lachrymose prime minister we've ever had. There are some 30 occasions during the Second World War when he is described as having tears in his eyes. And this is because he's a Regency figure. He's not some staid late Victorian. He's actually a throwback to a much grander and earlier past. Actually, at the funeral of Lord Nelson, every single one of the 8 admirals that carried his coffin, they were all in tears. Men allowed their emotions to show in the Regency period in a way that they simply didn't in the late Victorian period. So, yes, he was temperamental. He could shout at meetings and bang his fist, and he would be immensely tough. He would keep his chiefs of staff up till 2 or 3 or sometimes 4 o'clock in the morning. It was hard work for those around him, but he was trying to win a world war, and so that's perfectly understandable. He was trying to get his way, and he used every part of his personality to do that, including his fabulous sense of humour. There was one moment when Anthony Eden, his foreign secretary, was asking in a cabinet meeting what they could possibly do about Turkey. This was in November 1943. They were desperate to try and get Turkey into the war. And Turkey was resolutely neutral and had been since the beginning of the war 4 years earlier. And the question was, did they try to cajole Turkey? Did they try to threaten Turkey? Did they try to bribe Turkey? How could they get Turkey into the war? And at the end of this very hard-fought cabinet meeting, in which all the different points of view were put forward with great gusto by the people who were presenting them, Winston Churchill said, "Tell Turkey that Christmas is coming."
Among those whom Churchill greatly admired, some of whom you spoke of earlier, do you think he admired Napoleon?
Undoubtedly. He hugely admired Napoleon, which is very unusual for an English Tory, of course, who basically English Tories think of Napoleon as another Philip II of Spain, kind of dictatorial figure who wants to invade us, and therefore a bad thing. Churchill, on the other hand, made endless references to Napoleon in the House of Commons and in his speeches, none of them negative. He was in his private library, he has no fewer than 160 books about Napoleon that he had bound by his own leather binder. He wanted to write a biography of Napoleon, and in the 1930s, never got round to it. He wrote History of the English-Speaking Peoples instead. And he wanted also to write a film script about Napoleon, which would have been one of the fabulous things to have seen, or in your case, maybe to have acted in. It would have been really something. But no, he did admire Napoleon, and one can see why. There are overlaps between the personalities. The capacity for the compartmentalization of his mind. Larry Arnn refers to this in his book Churchill's Trial, the way in which Churchill was able to fasten onto a problem and concentrating on it to the exclusion of everything else until that problem was settled in his mind, is something that also you see in Napoleon a great deal.
Winston Churchill was always considered such a great speaker, but yet I had read that he had a speech impediment, particularly when he was younger. What methods did he use to overcome that, to really become such a great orator?
Well, he did have a sibilant emphasis where S's became SH's when he was younger. You hear much less of it as his career progresses. This isn't because he went to a speech therapist. There are some stories about him speaking with small stones in his mouth. I haven't seen any corroborative evidence of that. Have you, Richard? No. No, I think it's practice. It was just simply the extraordinary amount of time that he would practice. He would memorize these great long speeches in his early years, and then he would use psalm form, it was called, the way that they were printed out on his, typed out on his sheets of paper, little 6 by 4 inch cards that he would use. And he would sometimes spend as many hours practicing a speech as there were minutes in the speech. And it's an extraordinary thing. He would march backwards and forwards, often to the sound of marching music on the gramophone, and would rewrite the speech right up until the last moment, just before he stood up and gave it. You can see the annotations to the speech in his handwriting at Churchill College, Cambridge. I really do recommend you do that if you have a chance when next you're in England. But no, it was, he understood, in his only novel, Savrola, which was published in 1900, he wrote about the power of oratory, how important the power of oratory was, and how it was capable of working for people even at the lowest point, when no one will is following you. At least if they're still listening, you have a chance. And of course that chance was put to incredible effect in the campaign against appeasement in the 1930s. And then again, of course, uniting the nation in 1940.
Standing with Alan Packwood, holding a document at Churchill College, Cambridge, is indeed one of the thrills of life. I have a question about destiny. And you mentioned Churchill's quote from World War II, the night he became Prime Minister, felt as if I were walking with destiny. He also told Merlin Evans when he was, I think, about 15, about his feeling of destiny. Do you recall that one, where he's a student? What about this destiny that Churchill felt? And it was evidently replete throughout his life. Could you speak to Churchill's vision and his feelings for destiny?
Yes, it's another very good question. He had a very powerful sense of his own destiny. But I think, as I mentioned, through Gibbon and Winwood Reade and Lecky, indeed, he was not a Christian. He didn't believe in the divinity of Christ, but he did believe in fate, in providence, and in an almighty. He refers to the old man. He, with a capital H, he prayed to God when he was on the battlefield. So there was obviously a religious sense, a spiritual religious sense with regard to a divinity that was out there. But when one looks at it, it doesn't seem that God had many other jobs except for taking care of Winston Churchill. And yet it was, he never got to the point, such as Adolf Hitler did after the July plot in 1944, where he felt that his own will could overcommand that of providence or destiny. You know, he knew that he was the servant of destiny rather than its master. This wasn't a sort of insane feeling at all, but it was one actually that I think that quite a few politicians, probably even today, do have. And I think it was important for him when, in the First World War, he just left a trench dugout in order to see his general. And moments after he left it, a German whiz-bang, high-explosive shell, hit the dugout he was standing in and killed everybody inside it, decapitated his batman, etc. He put it down to providence.
We have time for one more question.
Could you say something about Churchill's early interest or training in science, or the lack thereof, and whether that played a role in his close relationship with Professor Lindemann regarding matters like the atom bomb, for example?
Yes. He was good at chemistry, actually, at Harrow. He discussed and was interested in physics, but read about physics, but wasn't examined in it or anything like that. But very, very early on, he, I think it was at 1923 or 1927, he wrote about the importance of the splitting of the atom and its possible military use. And that was, and his interest in physics also, as you allude, was at the heart of his friendship with the Oxford professor of physics, Professor Lindemann, later Lord Cherwell, who was far and away, during the war, far and away the closest of his friends to him. I've just been to Chequers, the Prime Minister's country house, and the Prime Minister very sweetly allowed me to spend a couple of hours looking at all the people, the names in the visitors' book of all the people who visited Chequers during the Second World War, and then later after the war as well. But I was particularly interested in the 1940 to 45 period during his first premiership. And Lord Cherwell turned up pretty much every single weekend that Winston Churchill was there, far, far more than pretty much all of the other close advisors of his put together. He couldn't but have had, he didn't have an influence on Churchill, nobody had an influence on Churchill. Churchill made up his own mind about everything, but he certainly had an input that was second to none, and they did discuss matters of physics which were so important during the Second World War. When one thinks of the beams, the ray beams, the importance of radar, as you mentioned, the atomic bomb, you know, Churchill had to be well up on all of these latest developments, and he was. That was the last question, but I'd just like to repeat, especially for you young people here, that fabulous line from my early life. And take it to heart, please, where he says, 20 to 25, those are the years. Don't be content with things as they are. You'll make all kind of mistakes, but as long as you're generous and true, and also fierce, you cannot hurt the world or seriously distress her. She was made to be wooed and won by youth. Thank you very much indeed.